Well, good morning, everybody. I feel like they were playing some kind of joke on me to come talk to you about global warming on a day like today. Thanks for making life easier. It did remind me, though, some years ago, the Washington Post, in the first Sunday after the new year, they have something in the opinion section on global trends, and I wrote something about climate change and conflict. And, you know, you get the love mail and the hate mail about it. That's normal. They reprinted it in other newspapers, and a couple days later it was reprinted in a paper in Florida, and it was the hottest day there ever in January. People wrote to me and said, "Man, you are a genius. You're a genius." A few days later, it was in a Vancouver paper where they had the biggest snowstorm in 20 years. Canadians are very polite people, but they didn't call me a genius. And I guess that's one misconception people have, is disconnecting climate and weather. And that happens all the time. I mean, even 2 or 3 year trends are still weather and not climate trends. We're talking about things 20 years or so to make it a climate trend. So I think a lot of conversations are way off the mark when it comes to talking about climate change and conflict, which I want to talk about today, because we're looking at long-term things, and even 3 years or 5 years is something in the short term. I want to talk about Africa because I think that's going to be kind of the nexus of climate change and conflict because of the overlap of a lot of different forces. First of all, let me just show you the latest from the IPCC. This is their AR5 report that shows the high and low forecast for the year 2100. They use something called RCPs, radiative concentration pathways. One of them is a 2.5, which is the low end. Most people think we've already pretty much gone beyond that. And on the right side is the high end, 8.5. And you can see most of the planet is about 10 degrees centigrade. Higher than today, the Arctic area is about 20 degrees. In fact, this year the Arctic had some of the warmest temperatures ever, and I had some friends in Alaska who said it's 40 degrees higher than they're used to just in the last 5 years. So there's some amazing changes going on, but it's not equally distributed around the planet, as you can see from the map. Some areas are going to see a lot more climate change than others. Actually, for the Northeast United States, we're going to be beneficiaries. It's going to be a little bit warmer. We might get a little bit more precipitation. We won't have as cold winters. We'll have longer growing seasons. There's definitely going to be winners and losers out of this. There are going to be losers. Another trend is population. Africa, by far, has the fastest growing population in the world. And you might be surprised to know which countries in Africa are the fastest growing. That's Mali, Chad, Niger. Actually have some of the fastest growth rates. And we all know from the last few years that these are hotbeds of radicalism, extremism. But there is an environmental element playing into these things because people are getting desperate with these high growth rates and high population trends and problems with climate already showing up in their growing seasons. These are starting to overlap. But if you see from this chart, by the year 2100, they'll about be equal to Asia in terms of population. Shortly after that, they will be the most populous continent in the world, Africa. Now, part of it is the rise of population of Africa. Part of it's the decline of Asia. China's going to fall to like 600 million people or something by then. Japan, Southeast Asia, all these countries are dropping in population. So you see those two different trends. But the fact that this is the most populous area in the world should wake some people up. I want to show you this figure, which is something called the dependency ratio, and that is the ratio of the people who are in the workforce versus those who aren't. Those who aren't in the workforce are retired or people in school, you know, disabled people, other things like that. Generally, we like to have high numbers of people in the workforce versus those who aren't. That's one of the problems that aging societies like China has, is that they're going to be, probably within 30 or 40 years, they're going to have so many more people who aren't in the workforce that it's going to start dragging on their economy. But you'll see right now, Africa has a huge youth bulge. And as a result of that, they have one of the lowest dependency ratios in the world. But by the end of this century, that's going to flip around. Most of the manufacturing in the world will be located in Africa because that's where most of the working age people in the world will be. In the United States, we'll have about a 1 to 2 ratio, and so there's going to be a lot more retired and young people there compared to what we have now. We're going to rely on them for making products, for being the driver of mechanization and industrialization in the world, and we got to hope that they go through some kind of demographic and economic transition to be able to do that. Also, these states have the most problems with governance. This is a map of the most fragile states in the world based on a number of indicators. It's from the Fund for Peace that combines social, economic, political indicators. Red's not a good color on these maps usually. Africa is completely red. So you've got high population growth rates, a need for these people to succeed, and now governance that cannot really meet the task at hand. We're going to be able to adapt to some of these climate change problems. Europe and other places will be too. They don't have the governments that are going to organize this. They're very weak governments there. Oops. Now here's another map I want to show you, two of them side by side. The one on my left, I guess it's your left too, shows a map of Africa in the year 2050 and the change in growing season. And the darkest red areas there are declines in the growing season of up to 114 days. That's about a third of the year. So if they're triple cropping, which isn't a good idea because you don't allow the land to fallow, that means they're going to lose one crop a year. But most of Africa, except for that green right through the center, is going to have shorter growing seasons. Most people in Africa today are still farmers and involved in agriculture. And we're counting on the fact that they're going to get income from agriculture to educate themselves, to go through the demographic transition, to reduce their birth rates. But now these people are going to have shorter growing seasons. They're going to make less money. They're going to get more desperate. They're going to think of other ways to survive. And ironically, if you look at the other map there, that's climate vulnerability, these same areas with the highest declines in growing season are also the most vulnerable to climate change. And if you know your demography of Africa, this is where most of the people live. They live in West Africa, around the Great Lakes region, Ethiopia, places like that. That's where most of the people live. This is a bad sign. They're going to have less food to grow, maybe become more dependent on foreign aid as a result. So let me stop here and just kind of lay out my line of thinking on this. In these climate models that I showed you, they're kind of based on inputs only. That is, how much carbon is coming into the atmosphere, how much is lost through radiation, but they don't account for feedback. So we have a sort of projection that says there's going to be this many people in the year 2100, and we expect they're going to produce this much carbon, and so that's how much we estimate is going to change due to climate change. But now, if we see a slowing in their demographic transition so that they don't go through it and have larger families, then we're going to be actually putting more carbon in the atmosphere because there's going to be more people. This is going to increase population growth rates, if you follow my logic here. And because the models don't account for that, it could be worse than the model suggests, because we don't have any feedback in that mechanism. These people might also become more desperate with the loss of agricultural land and go out and start cutting down a lot of forests and jungles, which are carbon sinks. That might actually increase it too. So the models don't take into account people very well. It's only a one-way impact. I think that if we took that into effect, the trends would be even more alarming. I mentioned there'll be a slowing in the agricultural productivity rate, and we're hoping for a huge green revolution in Africa at some point. I wonder if we're just going to be keeping pace with what's happening today by the virtue of the fact that climate change is going to reduce our gains from a green agricultural population. High population growth rates will persist, not only in Africa, but in South Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal. Those places are going to be growing very fast also. And as we look at solutions for climate change, which is getting away from carbon, well, carbon is related to economic growth. And a lot of people think if we start cutting out carbon, that's going to take off about a 1% GNP growth rate per year. So we're going to be reducing their potential for growth rate by a carbon decoupling policy when we want them to grow faster. I mentioned the weak government institutions that are not going to be able to handle these problems. And the real difficulty in all these things coming together is we're hoping there's going to be a soft landing for this, that people are going to kind of, muddle through and make it and come up with some solutions at some point. But maybe there's going to be a hard landing, where this is going to happen so fast and all at the same time that things are just going to get worse and worse and worse. Because what's happening is we're going to see the trends in climate change really start to pick up around mid-century, around 2050, at the time when their population growth rates will be the highest. So these two things will be happening at the same time. The lead time for changing these are 20 to 30 years. So, okay, we have a little more time, but every year we get closer and closer to that. Now, here's I think actually I saw some publication of yours that had this. This is from the Uppsala Prio data set on conflict around the world. They have a data set that goes back to 1946. This is armed conflict by region. Asia is the yellow. Africa is red. Mideast black. America's gray. Europe blue. And you'll see Africa, right after World War II, wasn't all that much involved with conflict. Now they have about as much as Asia. So you can see that their percentage has really ratcheted up over time. This looks a little hard to see. It's also something on a personal basis, and I want to make the point that when we talk about security concerns and conflict, it's just not governments. For a lot of places in Africa, it's personal security. One, because the governments are so weak, but also because the countries are so fragmented. They often have more allegiances to ethnicity and tribes than they do to governments. So if you look at this map, and this is homicide rates around the world, you see a breakdown in social stability, especially again in Africa. It's also happening in South America and Central America. But here is where personal security in the world is the lowest. So it's going to be happening to governments and individuals on a personal level, where you can see the fabric of society kind of breaking down a little bit. So, how do we get from climate change to conflict? People think this is kind of an automatic thing, and it's really a long chain of events like dominoes falling. It's not like people all rushing to Walmart to buy the last air conditioner. It's little things that happen over time that eventually lead to a concatenation of events. So one thing is the full belly and empty belly theory of conflict. Full belly says, okay, we had a good harvest, or our economy's going great, or we discovered oil, we got all this money coming in, we got extra money to spend, people need jobs, let's go to war. And that happens a lot. The other one is the empty belly theory, which is, okay, we had a bad harvest, we're running out of water, the little oil we had is already running out, we're kind of desperate here to go get somebody else's resources. So those are the two different kind of drivers you're going to see, full and empty belly theories. Also, people would go to war over the general resources, like controlling arable land or forests or water or things like that, or specific resources, tin, cadmium, molybdenum, who knows what rare elements are going to be crucial to our economies in the future. Some of the things that are in our cell phones today, you'd never even heard of 20 years ago, some rare minerals. So there's two different kinds of things that they fight for, either control over the territory or control over the resources. It's also important to remember that there's a lag factor going on there, that when you have climate change, it's not going to lead to conflict the next year. So let's take the case of a person who's just a small agriculturalist, grows a few crops, makes some money, provides for his family. Well, the first year of the drought, that's okay, we'll just cut back a little. Second year, okay, well, I think the the oldest son, now you can't go to school anymore, and you stay home, and we'll try to make things better. The third year, I think we're going to have to sell off some of those cows and sheep this year. Fourth year, well, none of the kids are going to school. The fifth year, they've sold off all their animals. The sixth year, they're eating their seed stock. And the seventh year, they're desperate for food. So it takes a long time for these things to play out. Also, there's so many factors at play in conflict. I mean, this is something that's so well known in international relations. I think people get so focused on climate change as a driver when it's just one of a lot of factors going on. Now, when you think about all the factors in Africa leading to conflict, there's grievances, there's colonial legacies, there's other countries' influences. When you put them all together, climate change is just one of a lot of things going on. But could it be the tipping point? Could it be the thing that pushes everything over the edge and just makes it a little worse? So again, I get a little upset that people seem to think this is a direct link and not just, you know, one other thing we got to take into account when we do some calculations on what causes conflict. Also, these things require triggers. It's usually associated with some political phenomenon. Take the genocide in Rwanda. Well, Rwanda's had genocides for quite a while between the Hutus and the Tutsis. What had been going on is, though there has been some climate change going on, it's become very overpopulated there. All of the Great Lakes countries are very overpopulated. They were triple cropping, and so their soil arability was going down. They were getting fewer and fewer harvests every year. And so there was tensions between the Hutus and the Tutsis. There was climate factors. There was grievances. There was declining arability. People's incomes were going down. But what started the genocide? It wasn't the climate change. It was shooting down the president's plane. So you've got this pile of wood there, and it's still a pile of wood, still somebody throws a match on it. Almost in all these cases, you've got to have a trigger. They just don't spontaneously combust. Also, we talk about adaptation to climate change, and that can lead to conflict in itself. They built these big dams in India to catch water from the Himalayas. Well, guess what? The people who are living along the rivers who are going to get flooded out aren't very happy about it, and sometimes this is 200 and 300,000 people. So adapting to climate change and trying to solve the problem is going to lead to conflict. Here's my theory. Hot wars and cold wars. These are the two kinds of climate and conflict interactions we're going to see in the future. The hot wars, the things around the equator there, and you can see where there's water problems and forest problems, that's been going on for a long time, thousands of years. You know, the Sahara used to be green 5,000 years ago. People moved out of the Sahara because it dried then and moved to places where there were rivers like the Nile River Basin and started civilizations. It was green 5,000 years ago. If you just think about the Bible and the green crescent that ran from roughly Israel to Baghdad, the Fertile Crescent. They called it fertile because it was green and there were forests, you know, the cedars of Lebanon. They've been cut down a long time ago. Humans changed the environment in the Middle East 2,000 years ago. They cut down a lot of the trees because these cities in Iraq, like Uruk and other ones, didn't have any wood. So they brought in these cedars and trees like that from Lebanon to build these great cities. They brought in sheep and goats that ate the seedlings. And now you have little plots of cedars around Lebanon that are actually protected by military sometimes because they're kind of a national symbol. So humans have been playing with this relationship for a long time, more than 2,000 years. What's new is the new tension belt around the Arctic, where before, and we've just been reading about, what was the guy's name who led the expedition to try to go through the Arctic? They just found some of his boats recently. Perry. Yeah. That was so inhospitable, people could never get through there. Now, there's Chinese ships going through there all the time. A few years ago, a Chinese icebreaker showed up in a small town in northern Canada, and, well, they didn't even go through the niceties of telling the government. They just kind of came there to take some pictures. And then when the Canadians found out, they hightailed it out of there. But if you think about this Arctic passage, pretty soon, China and Japan are going to be shipping their manufactured goods through the Arctic to New York and to Europe and not going through the Panama Canal. It's about 5,000 miles shorter. Not many pirates yet. You don't have to wait in line and pay to go through the canal. This is going to be a much cheaper thing, which makes a lot of people say, hey, why did they just widen this thing? And why is Nicaragua thinking of building another one when maybe they're going to be obsolete pretty soon? It's really only going to help trade between, say, San Francisco and Miami or something like that. Everybody else is going to go through the Northeast or the Northwest Passage, which Russia is going to control. That's actually warming at a faster rate, and partly because the industrialization of China is throwing all this soot up there that's getting on the glaciers and the ice packs that are melting it faster than what's happening in northern Canada and in Alaska. So those are my two theories. These are two different kinds of conflicts. One is about declining resources, developing countries, historical patterns. The other one is access to new resources between great powers who are going to get a lot more resources in the process and gain some strategic advantages. So let me just summarize those two kinds of wars. Hot wars, ancient, civil, tribal, less developed, tropical and desert habitats, continuous, low intensity, declining resources, a cause of migration, and a very long-term issue. Cold wars are modern, international, developed countries, cool and temperate habitats, very sporadic, potentially very high intensity, with an increasing resource base and an attraction for migrants and a lot of short-term issues. Now, if you look at the two there, you think to yourself, well, maybe all these people from the hot wars will want to migrate to the Arctic. And we're talking, you mentioned this, 2 billion people. This is going to change the demographic profile of Canada and Greenland and other places like that if they start letting in all these people. Lastly, let me just show you some decision-making tools I've developed. I've had some students over time working on case of climate and conflict. We've coded them as case studies with about 20 different categories. Who were the actors involved? Who won the conflict? How many people died? What was the scope of the conflict? What kind of environmental problem? Is it a regional problem, bilateral? And so there's a search engine here where you can search on all these categories, and you can even weight them. Okay, I want to make sure I'm looking at a habitat that's tropical, for example, and I can give it some more. And you'll see down there that it gives a search of different kinds of cases that come up based on pattern matching systems. So these are just some of the cases that an example I pulled up. But here's one example I built into it about the South China Sea and China building up these islands there, which is partly, believe it or not, a climate change issue. Because one reason the Chinese are so interested in building up these islands now is because they're already being encumbered by water due to sea level rise. If they didn't build these islands up, they would be gone in a while. So they want to get them now before they're underwater. And once they're underwater, they're technically no longer even islands. Actually, a lot of people don't even think they're islands to start with because they don't have a surface that is habitable by human beings 365 days a year. But here I've done a little scenario where I put in the South China Sea, I put in all the different variables there that I had, and you'll see it pulls up something about the Spratly Islands, the Scarborough Islands, Diaoyu, that's a conflict between Taiwan and Japan. Senkaku is Japan and China, Kuwait, Falklands. Here's the Korean-Japan island dispute. So it's pulled up a lot of cases that are similar. And the reason I'm showing you this is because a lot of times I've seen decision makers, when a new crisis comes up, they'll go into a meeting and say, oh, is this like this? Or is this like this conflict? Or is it like this crisis? Well, this is an automated tool that you can use to do that and pull up cases that have relevance to what you're looking for. So you could pull them up and look at historical case studies of similar types of conflict and environment, and from that determine, was this a good lesson learned, or was this a bad lesson learned? But at least something to get our minds around approaching conflict situations and give us some examples from the past via the use of case studies. I'm afraid I don't think we can get it any more statistical than providing kind of case studies we can think about. But this at least gives us a way to start thinking about what conflicts to look at the past and what happened. Particularly, did we win or lose that conflict? Did a lot of people lie? Did it last a long time? You could sort by those characteristics and try to look at those conflicts where we were successful versus the ones where we weren't, or another country. So, as you leave here today and go out into the freezing cold, 4 things maybe to think about. Climate change and people change are both important to security. You got to take both into account. Security is a state and a personal issue. And it's being redefined in a lot of these countries more in a personal way than it is a state issue. African countries need to do more to cooperate between themselves and solve some of these problems. For example, what we're already seeing is some rivers are drying up, and they don't have a lot of agreements on these river basin systems and how to manage them, use them, and who's going to get the rights to them. And there's been some cases already, especially in South Africa, between Namibia and Botswana and South Africa and Lesotho and Mozambique and Zimbabwe, where there's rivers disputes going on, where they're trying to take the river upstream and keep it from going downstream in a lot of cases, which is causing a lot of consternation. In fact, South Africa once led a coup in Lesotho because the highlands there are the source of a lot of water for South Africa. The second thing is they're exclusive economic zones. You'd be surprised that most of Africa's coastlines don't have much fish anymore. They've been fished out by the Russians, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Europeans. So a lot of people used to depend on fish. They don't have that anymore. They have really no control over the exclusive economic zones. This is not only an economic problem, but it's a security problem too, if they don't control their coastlines. We actually go in and help them patrol some of their exclusive economic zones. And lastly, think about this problem as something 5,000 years old and not something that, people just sort of invented in the last 20 years. This stuff's been going on for a long time. And let's start thinking about some good tools that we can develop and maybe test out with military people to see in actual situations. How can we get ahead of these things instead of always trying to be behind and catch up with them?